I never thought I'd be the kind of woman someone would give up everything for. Never. Imagined that at 47 years old, with gray threading through my dark hair and permanent exhaustion carved into the lines around my eyes, someone would look at me and decide I was worth more than money, more than family approval, more than the entire comfortable future that had been mapped out for them since birth. But that's exactly what happened the day Ethan walked into my failing bookstore and told me he wanted to work there, wanted to help me save it, wanted to stay, even though staying meant losing absolutely everything else in his life. I'm telling you this story because I still don't fully understand it myself, still wake up some mornings convinced it was all an elaborate dream, that I'll open my eyes and find myself back in that nightmare version of my existence where the bookstore was circling the drain and I was going down with it, alone and invisible, and absolutely certain that the best parts of my life were already behind me, locked away in some inaccessible past I'd never get back to. But then I feel his arm draped across me or hear him moving around in the kitchen making coffee exactly the way I like it, and I remember that somehow, impossibly, miraculously, this beautiful young man chose me, and I need you to understand how that felt, how it still feels every single day, like being handed oxygen when you've been drowning for so long you'd forgotten what breathing felt like. Before I continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The bookstore had been my grandmother's originally, a small cluttered place tucked between a coffee shop. That changed owners every 2 years, and what used to be a thriving hardware store before it closed down, located on a street that had definitely seen better days, back when downtown actually meant something. Back before the mall opened on the highway and sucked the life out of small local businesses like mine. I'd taken over the store 15 years ago when my grandmother died, had poured absolutely everything I had into keeping it alive, into maintaining it as the kind of place where people could wander in and discover books they didn't even know they needed, where high school kids could hang out after school without being harassed to constantly buy something, where elderly people could sit in the worn reading nook by the window and not feel crushingly lonely for a few precious hours, and for a while, for a good long while actually. It worked. The store not just survived but actually thrived in its own modest way. I had regular customers who came in weekly. I knew their names and their reading preferences. I hand-sold books I knew would change people's lives the way books had changed mine when I was young and lost and searching for meaning. But then everything started falling apart in that slow, inevitable way that things do when you're not paying close enough attention. My marriage disintegrated. First, my husband announcing over breakfast one completely ordinary Tuesday morning that he was done, just done with everything, done with our marriage, done with small-town life, done with me specifically, and the divorce that followed was swift and brutal and took half of everything, including my confidence and my fundamental faith that anyone would ever choose me first, would ever put me before their own comfort and convenience. Then the economy shifted in ways I didn't fully understand, something about online retailers and changing consumer habits. And the massive chain bookstore opened up 15 minutes away on the commercial strip with discounts I couldn't at possibly match in a cafe that actually made good coffee, and slowly, steadily, painfully, my customer base eroded. The foot traffic dwindled to almost nothing. The bills kept arriving with frightening regularity, and I watched my grandmother's legacy, my life's entire work, the thing I'd sacrificed my marriage and my youth and every ounce of energy for, die by inches while I stood helplessly behind the counter day after day pretending everything was fine, pretending I wasn't drowning in debt and despair, pretending I didn't lie awake every single night doing impossible math in my head, calculating how many more months I could possibly keep the doors open before I'd have to accept complete and utter defeat. I was sorting through yet another box of used books someone had donated, most of them water-damaged and completely unsellable, the kind of books people give you when they're cleaning out their basements and want to feel charitable, without actually helping, when the door chimed with that familiar tinny sound and I looked up from the moldy paperbacks, expecting to see one of my few remaining regular customers, probably Mrs. Henderson, who came in religiously every Tuesday to browse the mystery section for exactly 45 minutes and never actually bought anything, but instead There was this young man I'd never seen before, tall and dark-haired and wearing an expensive wool coat that looked completely and absurdly out of place in my shabby store with its peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights that I couldn't afford to replace, and the persistent smell of old paper and defeat that I'd stopped noticing. He was looking around the store with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between nostalgia and determination, like he was remembering something important or steeling himself for something difficult. And when his eyes finally landed on me standing there behind the cluttered counter with dust on my hands and resignation in my face, he smiled, and it wasn't the polite, impersonal smile strangers usually give shopkeepers. It was something warmer, something more personal, something that made me feel like he knew me, even though I was absolutely certain we'd never met before in my life. He walked directly over to the counter with confident strides, not browsing the shelves or pretending interest in the displays, just came straight to me like he had a specific purpose. And he said, his voice quiet but remarkably steady for someone who looked barely out of college, that he'd heard I might need help with the store, and I felt my defenses immediately rise because I'd learned the hard way to be suspicious of anyone offering anything that sounded too good to be true, and I said, probably, more harshly than necessary, that I wasn't hiring, couldn't afford to hire anyone, could barely afford to pay myself at this point if I was being completely honest. He nodded like he'd expected exactly that response, and said without hesitation that he did work for free if necessary, didn't need money, just wanted the chance to be around books, to learn the business from someone who clearly loved it. And I should have been more suspicious, should have asked more pointed questions, should have understood that. Absolutely no one offers to work for free without some kind of hidden agenda, but I was so tired, so desperately bone-deep tired, and the idea of having even unpaid help, of not being completely alone in my failure, of having another human being in the store who might actually care about whether it survived, was too tempting to refuse outright. His name was Ethan, I learned, Ethan Castellano, and the last name should have meant something to me immediately, but it didn't. Not right away. Not until he'd been working at the store for a full week and Mrs. Henderson came in for her usual Tuesday browse and pulled me aside with barely contained excitement to whisper that he was Thomas Castellano's son, that his father owned half the commercial real estate downtown, including the actual building my bookstore was in, that the Castellanos were basically local royalty, old money mixed with new influence, the kind of family that got their names on hospital wings and scholarship funds, and that absolutely everyone in town was talking about why the heir to that considerable fortune was spending his days shelving books and sweeping floors in my dying store when he should have been in his father's gleaming office learning to run the family empire. I felt something cold settle in my stomach when she told me this, felt betrayed and manipulated and angry that he hadn't been honest with me from the start, and I confronted him that afternoon after we closed, asked him directly why he hadn't told me who he was, what he was really doing here, what he actually wanted from me, whether this was some kind of bizarre research project or slumming experiment or tax right-to-off scheme I didn't understand. Ethan looked at me with those dark, serious eyes that seemed too old for his young face and said, his voice careful and sincere, that he'd been coming to my store since he was 16 years old, that I probably never noticed him because he'd always been deliberately quiet, always tucked himself into the back corners with whatever book he was reading, trying to be invisible, but that this place, my bookstore, specifically, had been his refuge during the absolute worst years of his life, during his parents' vicious divorce and his father's increasing pressure for him to abandon his own dreams and step into the predetermined role of heir and successor. He said I'd created something that actually mattered, something rare and valuable, a space where people could exist without performing or competing or constantly justifying their existence. And he couldn't stand by and watch it disappear without at least trying to help save it. Couldn't live with himself if he didn't make an attempt, even if that attempt ultimately failed. I wanted desperately to tell him to leave, wanted to protect myself from whatever complicated situation this was clearly going to become, from the inevitable complications of having Thomas Castellano's son working in my store. From the moment when Ethan would inevitably get bored, or his father would successfully intervene, or harsh reality would intrude, and he'd realize he'd made a terrible mistake, and I'd be left even more alone than before. But I didn't tell him to leave because I needed him. Genuinely needed his help with the heavy boxes I could barely lift anymore, and the repairs I'd been putting off for months because I couldn't afford to hire anyone, and the updated inventory system he'd already started implementing with efficient competence. And more than that, more than the practical help, I needed his steady presence in the store that made me feel less crushingly alone, less like I was fighting an unwinnable battle entirely by myself, with no one to even witness my struggle. So I said, okay, you can stay, but don't expect me to be grateful, don't expect me to make this easy for you. Don't expect anything from me except honest work and brutal honesty about how bad things really are, and he said he didn't expect anything. Except the chance to be useful, the opportunity to help save something worth saving, and something about the way he said it, the absolute sincerity in his voice and the determination in his eyes, made my throat tight with emotions I didn't want to examine. Ethan was 24 years old, I eventually learned, young enough to be my son if I'd had children. Young, the way my mother had, and that age gap sat between us constantly like a wall I couldn't ignore or climb over, even though he seemed completely and utterly unconcerned by it, treated it like it was irrelevant information, rather than the massive, obvious problem it clearly was. I watched the way he moved through the store with easy, unself-conscious confidence, the way he talked to customers with genuine interest rather than the fake enthusiasm most retail workers developed. The way he'd stay late helping me with tedious tasks I'd been putting off for months or even years. The way he'd suggest ideas for improving the business with an optimism I'd lost somewhere along the way, and I couldn't understand any of it. Couldn't make sense of why someone, with his entire privileged life ahead of him, with opportunities and family money and presumably plenty of romantic options among women his own age, would choose to spend his time here with me, would look at me with something that felt dangerously and impossibly close to genuine admiration. The town noticed immediately. Of course they noticed. Small places are like that. Everyone knows everyone else's business and speculates constantly about everyone's motivations and secret lives. It's the primary entertainment in places where nothing much happens, and I started hearing the whispers within days. Started seeing the pointed looks and raised eyebrows, the older women at the coffee shop next door positioning themselves by the window so they could watch through the glass when Ethan and I worked together. And I knew exactly what they were thinking. Knew they were creating elaborate narratives about the older divorced woman and the young wealthy man, about what I must be offering him, what he must be getting from this arrangement. What kind of desperate, pathetic cougar behavior I must be engaging in to keep him interested. The assumptions made me feel physically sick, made me want to send him away immediately just to stop the malicious gossip. Made me lie awake at night, imagining all the things people were saying about me, about us, about what we were supposedly doing. But Ethan didn't seem to care about the whispers at all, didn't seem to notice them, or maybe just refused to let them affect his behavior or decisions. And when I finally worked up the courage to bring it up, to suggest as gently as possible that maybe he should reconsider this arrangement, that people were talking, that this didn't look good for either of us but especially for him, that his reputation in this town was being damaged by association with me, he just looked at me calmly and said he'd never particularly cared what small-minded people thought about his choices, and he wasn't about to start caring now. I said it was different for him. He was young and male, and from a powerful family. People would ultimately give him the benefit of the doubt, would assume he was doing charity work or going through some phase. But me, I was the older woman. I was the one they'd assume was taking advantage, was being predatory, was using him somehow, and Ethan said anyone who actually knew me for 5 minutes would know that was completely impossible, that if anything, he was the one benefiting from being here, learning from me, and I said learning what exactly? How to run a failing business into the ground, how to waste your potential, how to disappoint your family, and he said no. Learning what it actually means to care about something more than profit margins. Learning what integrity looks like in practice. Learning that some things are genuinely worth fighting for even when the fight seems completely hopeless and everyone rational is telling you to give up. His father showed up on a Thursday afternoon about 3 weeks after Ethan started. Working at the store, walked in wearing a suit that probably cost more than my entire monthly revenue, maybe more than my quarterly revenue at this point. And I knew immediately who he was even though we'd never been formally introduced. The family resemblance was impossible to miss. The same dark hair, though Thomas's was graying. Elegantly at the temples, the same strong jawline, though his was set harder. With what looked like permanent disapproval, the same tall frame, though he carried himself with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from never being told no. Thomas Castellano looked around my store with barely concealed contempt, taking in the worn carpet and the mismatched shelves and the clearance table by the door with its desperately reduced prices, and then he looked directly at me, really looked at me for the first time, taking in my age, and my faded jeans and my hair pulled back in a messy knot because I'd been unpacking boxes all morning, and I saw the exact moment he decided I wasn't worth his respect, wasn't worth basic human courtesy, wasn't worth treating like an actual person rather than an obstacle to be removed. He said without any preamble or polite introduction that he was here to collect his son, that this little experiment or whatever Ethan wanted to call it had gone on quite long enough, that Ethan had real responsibilities and an actual future that didn't include wasting his considerable talents and education in a failing bookstore that would be closed within 6 months regardless of whatever sentimental efforts were made to save it. I felt anger flash hot and bright in my chest, but forced myself to keep my voice level and professional, forced myself to say that Ethan was a legal adult and could make his own decisions about how to spend his time, and Thomas actually laughed, a cold dismissive sound, and said not when those decisions were so clearly being influenced by someone with obvious ulterior motives, someone who was taking advantage of a young man's misplaced idealism for her own purposes. Ethan emerged from the back room before I could formulate a response. Must have heard his father's unmistakable voice, and he said, his own voice tight with barely controlled anger, that he'd specifically asked his father not to come here, not to harass me, not to interfere with his choices, and Thomas said he wasn't harassing anyone. He was simply trying to make his son see reason, trying to prevent him from throwing away everything the family had built for some misguided sense of charity or whatever misguided impulse this was. Ethan said it wasn't charity and it wasn't misguided, it was a deliberate choice. He was consciously choosing to be here, choosing to help save something that actually mattered to real people. And Thomas said with withering condescension that the only thing that should matter to Ethan was family loyalty, was the business they'd been building for 3 generations, was taking his proper place in the world instead of playing at being a shopkeeper. Ethan said maybe he wanted to build something different, something that actually helped people and created value beyond just extracting maximum profit from every transaction. And Thomas looked at his son with something that might have been disappointment or might have been rage. It was hard to tell, and said if Ethan insisted on continuing this absurd nonsense, then there would be consequences. He'd be cut off financially. No more trust fund access, no more family support, no more safety net. He'd be completely on his own, and Ethan said without hesitation that if that's what it took, then fine. He accepted those terms, and Thomas left, the door slamming behind him, and I stood there physically, shaking, and Ethan immediately turned to me and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry you had to witness that." And I said, "You should go after him. You should fix this before it's too late. You can. To throw away your entire future for this place, for me, you just can." "T?" And Ethan said, his voice dropping low and intense, "You still Dawn. To understand, this isn't primarily about the store. It's about you." The words hung heavy in the air between us, too significant to ignore, too honest to casually dismiss, and I felt something crack wide open in my chest, some defensive wall I'd been carefully maintaining for years. And I said, "What do you mean it's about me?" And Ethan said, "I told you I'd been coming here since I was 16, that this place was my refuge during difficult times. But what I didn't tell you was that you were a fundamental part of that refuge, that watching you run this store year after year, watching the way you treated every single customer with genuine dignity regardless of whether they bought anything, watching the way you somehow knew exactly what books people needed before they even knew themselves, watching the way you created this space that felt safe and welcoming and uncynical in a cynical world, watching you do all of that consistently made me believe that truly good people still existed, that there was another way to live besides the cutthroat transactional business world my father inhabited and was trying to force me into. I said, that's not really about me, though. That's about the store, about what it represents. And Ethan said, no, it's absolutely about you specifically. The store is just physical space, just bricks and books and shelving. You're what makes it matter. You're what animated it. You're what I wanted to help save. And I said, you can't save people. That's not how any of this works. And he said, I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to stand beside you while you save yourself. And I said, that's just semantics. And he said, no, it's everything. It's the entire point. I told him he needed to leave. Told him clearly and directly that he was confused, that he was throwing his privileged life away for some idealized version of me that didn't actually exist anywhere outside his imagination, that I was just a tired, middle-aged woman with a failing business and no prospects and nothing special to offer anyone. Told him he could have anyone he wanted, anyone at all could have absolutely everything, and he was catastrophically wasting it here on me. And Ethan just looked at me with those steady dark eyes that never wavered and said, do you actually want me to leave? Not should I leave. Not what makes logical sense, but do you genuinely want me gone? And I opened my mouth to say yes, to do the responsible, mature thing, to protect him from making a terrible mistake, to protect myself from the inevitable crushing hurt when he finally realized his error and left me even more broken than I already was. But the word wouldn't come out, wouldn't form, because the absolute truth was that I didn't want him to leave. Hadn't wanted anything as desperately as I wanted him to stay, and my silence was apparently answer enough. And Ethan said, then I'm staying. And I said, this is completely crazy, and he said, probably, but I don't care even a little bit. The weeks that followed were strange and charged with tension, filled with something neither of us was quite willing to name out loud. Ethan worked at the store during the day and had gotten himself a night job bartending at a restaurant downtown to pay for the modest apartment he'd rented after his father made good on his threat to cut off all family money, and I watched him work himself to absolute exhaustion and felt crushing guilt, felt personally responsible for the destruction of his relationship with his family, felt like I should send him away immediately for his own good, regardless of what he said he wanted. But every single time I tried to bring it up, tried to initiate the conversation about how this couldn't continue, he'd deflect skillfully, would point to the tangible improvements we were making to the store, the community events we were planning, the way foot traffic had increased slightly because people were morbidly curious about Thomas Castellano's son working in a bookstore. And he'd say, see, it's actually working. We're going to save this place, and I'd feel something I hadn't felt in years, actual genuine hope, along with terror that I was letting myself believe in something that would inevitably be taken away. But it wasn't just hope I was feeling. There was something else growing between us, something I was trying desperately and futilely to ignore, trying to convince myself I was imagining or misinterpreting. But I'd catch him watching me sometimes, when he thought I wasn't paying attention, watching with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, but that made my skin feel warm, or our hands would accidentally brush when we were both reaching for the same book, and the contact would feel electric, would linger a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary, would make my breath catch, or he'd stand close behind me while we were both looking at something on the computer screen, and I'd feel the solid warmth of him, the physical presence of him, and I'd have to consciously force myself to breathe normally, to not lean back into that warmth, to remember all the many reasons this absolutely couldn't happen, all the ways it would end in disaster. The breaking point came on a Friday night after we'd successfully hosted our first author reading in over a year, an event that had actually gone. Well, people had actually come, they'd actually bought books, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the store felt genuinely alive, felt like it might actually have a future, might actually survive. And I was feeling almost euphoric as we cleaned up together, putting chairs back in their proper places, sweeping floors, straightening shelves. And I said to Ethan, thank you, truly thank you for making this happen, for believing this was even possible when I'd completely given up. And he said, I didn't make anything happen. You did this. You've always been doing this. I just helped a little bit. And I said, no, you don't understand. I was genuinely giving up. I was ready to let it all go. You're the one who made me keep fighting. And Ethan was quiet for a long moment, then said, can I tell you something? Something I've been trying to say for weeks now. And I said yes. And he said, I didn't do this just to save the bookstore. I did it because I couldn't stand watching you give up on yourself, couldn't stand seeing you diminish yourself and your accomplishments. Couldn't stand knowing you thought you didn't matter when you're literally the person who matters most. And I said, Ethan, please. And he said, let me finish. I need to say this. I've been halfway in love with you since I was 18 years old, and you helped me find an architecture book for a school project and spent 20 minutes talking to me about design philosophy like my opinions actually mattered, and I've been completely fully in love with you since the day I walked back in here and saw you trying to hold everything together entirely by yourself. And I know there are 1,000 reasons why you're going to say this can't happen. I know about the age difference and the gossip and your fear of being hurt again, but I need you to know that I'm not confused. I'm not going through some phase. I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and regret this. I love you. I've loved you for years, and I left everything, my family, and my money and my predetermined future, because being here with you is worth infinitely more than anything my father could possibly offer me. I couldn't breathe, literally couldn't get air into my lungs, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was saying because it felt impossible, felt like an elaborate fantasy I'd been too scared to even let myself imagine. And I said, you don't really love me. You love some idealized version of me that doesn't actually exist. I'm not who you think I am. I'm just ordinary. I'm just tired. I'm just trying to survive day to day. And Ethan said, you're not ordinary, you're extraordinary, you're kind and brave and resilient, and you create beauty and meaning in a world that doesn't value those things. And I said, I'm too old for you. This is inappropriate. People will judge. And he said, age is literally just a number. It doesn't change how I feel or what I know. And I said, people will judge, will say terrible things. And he said, let them judge, let them say whatever they want. And I said, you'll regret this. You'll wake up one day and realize you wasted your youth on someone who couldn't give you what you deserved. And he said, the only thing I'll ever regret is if I don't at least try to make you understand how I feel. And I said, I'm scared. I'm so scared. And he said, I know. I'm scared too. But Lily, please, just let me love you. Let me prove to you that you're worth choosing, that you've always been worth choosing. And he said my name like it was precious, like it meant something profound. And I felt tears streaming down my face because no one in my entire life had ever fought for me like this, had ever seen me like this, had ever made me feel like I was worth anything more than what I could provide or do for them. And I said, okay, but you have to promise me something. Promise me that when you inevitably realize you made a mistake, you'll tell me honestly. You won't just disappear. And Ethan said, I promise, but I won't. Realize that because I haven't made a mistake, this is the rightest thing I've ever done. And he reached out slowly, carefully, giving me every possible chance to pull away, and touched my face with such gentleness. And I didn't pull away, couldn't pull away, and he kissed me, gentle and careful and absolutely certain. And I kissed him back and felt something that had been frozen solid in me for years start to finally thaw. We didn't tell anyone at first, kept the relationship private and quiet while we both figured out what it was, what it meant, what it could become. and those early weeks were simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating in ways I hadn't experienced since I was much younger. I kept waiting constantly for the other shoe to drop, kept waiting for Ethan to realize he'd been wrong about me, but he never did. He just kept showing up every single day, kissed me good morning with sleepy affection, worked beside me at the store with easy partnership, took me to dinner at quiet restaurants outside of town where no one would recognize us, and we could pretend to be normal. Held my hand in the comforting darkness of movie theaters, and slowly, painfully slowly, I started to believe. This might actually be real, might actually last, might be something I was genuinely allowed to have and keep. The store was improving too, in tangible, measurable ways. Ethan had somehow secured a small business loan using some savings he'd carefully hidden from his father before the cutoff, and we were able to make actual necessary repairs, update the ancient website, increase inventory, start marketing properly, and word was spreading organically that the bookstore was worth visiting. Again, that something special and different was happening there, and I felt like I was living two completely parallel lives. One where I was a middle-aged business owner trying desperately to save her grandmother's legacy, and one where I was a woman in an actual relationship with a man who looked at her like she hung the moon, and I honestly didn't know which felt more surreal. The gossip intensified dramatically when someone from town saw us together. At a restaurant one evening, saw Ethan reach across the table and take my hand, saw the way we looked at each other with obvious affection. And by the next morning it felt like absolutely everyone knew, felt like everyone was talking about us, about what we were doing, about what it meant, and the whispers were uglier than I'd even anticipated. People saying I was pathetic, desperate, that I was obviously taking advantage of a young man who didn't know any better, that I should be ashamed of myself, and I wanted to hide, wanted to end things immediately, before they got worse, before the judgment damaged Ethan's life more than it already had. But Ethan said absolutely not, said he was completely done hiding, done caring what small-minded people thought about his private life, and he took my hand in public, kissed me on the street corner, directly outside the bookstore where literally anyone could see, and said, "Let them talk, let them judge all they want. I don't care at all. I love you, and I'm not ashamed of that. And you shouldn't be either." His father tried one final time to intervene, showed up at the store with an actual lawyer in tow, tried to argue that Ethan was clearly mentally unwell, that I'd obviously manipulated him somehow. That legal action would be taken if I didn't immediately end the relationship, and I felt physically sick listening to him, felt all the old fears and insecurities rise up and threaten to drown me, the certainty that I wasn't worth this much trouble. But Ethan stepped physically between me and his father and said in a voice I'd never heard him use before that if his father pursued this, he did never speak to him again, would consider him completely dead, that I was the woman he loved, and if his father couldn't accept that, then he wasn't Ethan's family anymore in any meaningful sense. Thomas looked at his son with something that might have been grief mixed with fury and said, "You're throwing your entire life away." And Ethan said, "No, I'm finally actually living it for the first time." And Thomas left, and I held Ethan while he shook with anger and hurt and adrenaline. And I said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry you had to make that choice." And Ethan said, "I didn't have to choose. I wanted to choose. I'd choose you. I'll always choose you." And I believed him, finally, fully, completely believed him. The bookstore not only survived but actually started to thrive in ways I genuinely hadn't thought possible anymore. The publicity from the scandal, from the gossip, from the dramatic story, had brought curious people in initially. But many of them stayed because they discovered what I'd always known deep down, that bookstores like mine mattered in ways that couldn't be quantified, that the experience of physically browsing books and getting personal recommendations from actual humans who read couldn't be replaced by algorithms, and Ethan and I worked side by side building something together, building not just a business but an actual life, and some people never accepted us, never stopped judging and whispering, but others eventually came around, saw that we were genuinely happy together, saw that Our relationship was based on real love and mutual respect and true partnership, and Mrs. Henderson actually apologized to me one day, said she. I'd been wrong to gossip and judge, that watching us together had reminded her what love looked like when it wasn't performing for anyone else, and I thanked her and genuinely meant it because forgiveness matters. Living with Ethan was different than anything I'd experienced in my previous marriage. There was no power struggle, no resentment, no keeping score, just actual partnership. We divided responsibilities based on who was better at what, rather than traditional gender roles, made decisions together, rather than one person dictating, supported each other's dreams and goals, rather than competing. And yes, people still stared when we went out together, yes. The age difference was visually obvious to everyone, yes. There were moments when I felt self-conscious or worried about the future, about what would happen when I got even older, when the gap became even more pronounced. But Ethan never once made me feel anything but beautiful and valued and chosen, never made me doubt that he'd selected exactly what he wanted. And when I voiced these fears, he'd say that he hadn't fallen in love with me because of my age. He'd fallen in love with me for who I fundamentally was as a person, for my strength and my kindness, and my way of seeing the world. And those things didn't have an expiration date. Those qualities would only deepen with time rather than diminish. 2 years after Ethan first walked into my failing bookstore and changed absolutely everything. We had a small private ceremony, just a handful of close friends who'd supported us and made our relationship legally official, made our commitment permanent, and I wore a simple dress that made me feel beautiful, and Ethan wore a suit. And we promised to choose each other every single day, to support each other's continued growth, to build a life that mattered and helped others. And his father wasn't there, had refused the invitation entirely, but Ethan's mother had actually divorced Thomas the year before, said watching her son fight for real love had given her the courage to finally leave a marriage that had been emotionally dead for decades. And she hugged me tight and said, "Thank you for loving my son. Thank you for seeing him as he truly is." And I said, "Thank you for raising someone capable of this kind of deep love." And we both cried together in that beautiful way women do when they recognize each other's pain and strength. The bookstore became something bigger than either of us had originally imagined. We expanded into the vacant space next door, opened a small cafe area, started hosting weekly events, created a space that felt like a genuine community hub, rather than just a retail location. And I'd stand sometimes at the counter watching Ethan help a customer find exactly the right book, watching him light up when he talked about stories and ideas, watching him build exactly the kind of meaningful life his father had considered worthless. And I'd think about the woman I'd been just 3 years ago, about how close I'd come to giving up entirely, about how I'd been absolutely certain I had nothing left to offer the world, nothing worth fighting for. And I'd marvel at how completely wrong I'd been, how a single person's unwavering belief in you could change absolutely everything, could give you back yourself when you'd thought yourself irretrievably lost. I'm not going to tell you it was easy. I'm not going to pretend the age difference never caused complications, or that the gossip didn't hurt, or that I didn't have regular moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I was being selfish, if Ethan would have been better off with someone younger who could give him more years, more conventional acceptance. But every single time those doubts crept in, Ethan would do something, would look at me a certain way, or say something that made it absolutely clear he'd never once doubted his choice, never regretted leaving his father's fortune, never wished he'd chosen differently. And I learned slowly, painfully, slowly, to accept that I was allowed to be loved like this, that I deserved it, that the story I'd been telling myself for years about being too old, too damaged, too ordinary, was simply wrong, that love didn't care about arbitrary social measurements. That connection happened when it happened, and trying to force it into conventional boxes only diminished its power and beauty. Looking back now with the perspective of time, I understand that Ethan didn't actually save me, not really. I was already saving myself, already fighting to keep the bookstore alive, already showing up every day, even when it felt completely hopeless. What Ethan did was see that fight, recognize it for what it was, value it deeply, and choose to join it. Choose to stand beside me and say you don't have to do this alone anymore. And that witnessing, that choosing, that absolute refusal to let me diminish myself or give up, that was the real gift. Not rescue, but recognition. Not salvation, but true partnership. And I learned from him what I should have known all along, but had somehow forgotten, that I was worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth loving, not because of what I could provide or what I looked like or how I fit into someone's predetermined life plan, but simply because of who I was fundamentally as a human being. And once I truly learned that, once I genuinely believed it in my bones, everything else became possible in ways I couldn't have imagined. The bookstore thrives now, 5 full years later, has become exactly what I always dreamed it could be. A genuine place where people discover not just books but community and connection and themselves, where teenagers can hide from difficult homes and feel safe, where elderly people can feel less crushingly alone, where anyone can walk in and be treated with dignity and kindness regardless of whether they buy anything. And Ethan and I run it together as true equal partners in every sense. And yes, people still sometimes whisper, still sometimes judge, still sometimes question our relationship and our choices, but their opinions feel smaller now, feel less important than what we've actually built together, both the physical space and the life we share. And when I look at Ethan now, when I watch him interact with customers or plan our next community event or simply exist in the world with that quiet confidence I first noticed years ago, I feel grateful. Deeply, endlessly grateful that he walked into my failing bookstore on that autumn afternoon. Grateful that he was brave enough to leave everything behind. Grateful that he saw something worth saving in me when I'd completely stopped seeing it myself. Grateful that he taught me what it truly means to be chosen. Really chosen. Not for what you can provide, but for who you fundamentally are. And if you're listening to this thinking that your story is over, that you're too old or too damaged or too ordinary for love, for recognition, for someone to fight for you, I'm here to tell you with absolute certainty that you're wrong. I was wrong too. Catastrophically wrong. And the most extraordinary thing about my life is that it actually began again at 47. Began when I'd been certain it was ending. Began because one person looked at me and said, "You matter. You're worth everything. I choose you." And that changed absolutely everything. About how I saw myself and what I believed was possible. And maybe, just maybe, someone is about to walk into your life and say the same thing. And when they do, when that moment finally comes, I hope you're brave enough to believe them, brave enough to let them in, brave enough to accept that you deserve to be chosen, because you do. We all do. Every single one of us. And sometimes love shows up exactly when we've stopped expecting it, in the form we least anticipate, from the person who makes no logical sense on paper, but every sense in reality. And that's the beautiful, impossible truth I learned in my failing bookstore. From a young man who left his father's fortune to be with me, that love doesn't care about our rules or our fears or our stories about why we're not enough. It just shows up and asks us to be brave, and being brave, saying yes, choosing to believe even when it seems impossible, that's how we save ourselves. That's how we save each other. That's how we build lives that genuinely matter and create meaning that extends beyond ourselves. And I'm living proof that it's never too late. That transformation is always possible. That being chosen can change everything if you let it. If you're brave enough to accept it. If you're strong enough to believe you deserve it, because you do. And that's what I want you to take from my story. That's what I hope you remember, that it's never too late to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved exactly as you are.